What's going on, everyone? Welcome to the channel. So today we're going to get into something a little bit different. There's a truly incredible storyline to talk about, and that is the life story of Austin Forkner. Now, if you follow the sport of motocross at all, you probably know who Austin is. However, I doubt that you know his full story, so that's what we're going to get into today. Now, if you do not follow the sport of motocross, I do believe you would still find his story pretty incredible and easy to follow along. So either way, strap in for the wild ride that is Austin Forkner's life story. This is not an extensive list of everything that Austin's ever done or accomplished or gone through. This is just a story that I have put together, highlighting some of the highs and lows that Austin has gone through. I feel like he has a really incredible story, and I also feel like motocross racers in general tend to go through so much and they are so easily forgotten. And I think it's time that we draw more attention to those struggles that they go through and really appreciate all the effort that these guys are putting in, as well as the sacrifices that they and their families have to make. And lastly, I think it's time we draw some more attention to the huge amount of risk that these guys are going through on a weekly basis, and I feel like Austin's story is a great way to do that. So to really paint the picture of just how incredible Austin's story is, we have to rewind all the way back to 1989, before Austin was born, and take a look at his mother, Julie. So at this time, Julie was dealing with some health problems, and we really don't need to get into that too much, but long story short, she ended up having to have surgery, and as a result of these surgeries, the chances of her being able to have a child afterwards were only about 10%. 1 year later, Julie would go on to marry Mike Forkner, and they would begin paying around $900 a month for fertility treatment in order to try to have a child together. After 6 years of trying, Julie finally conceived a child, and they picked out the name Matthew. Unfortunately, Matthew had a rare chromosomal condition that affects only about 1 in 16,000 infants, and he did not make it. After 6 years of trying, Mike and Julie were both physically and financially done. At the end of 1997, Julie had scheduled a hysterectomy, which is the surgical procedure to remove her uterus. At age 36, Julie had given up, not because of her age, but because of what she had been through. Her doctor, however, saw something and had a hunch. She did some blood work and it came back negative. But she insisted and told Julie, "You know what? I think you're pregnant." Julie had no symptoms and the test just came back negative, and she thought her doctor was just stalling. But the doctor told her, "Just go home, give it some time, and let's see what happens." Then, in the second week of January, Julie reported to her doctor that she had a pretty stubborn flu that just wouldn't go away, and her doctor told her, "Why don't you go buy a pregnancy test?" So she did. She went down to the store and came back, and sure enough, it came back positive. Then, on September 2nd of 1998, a perfectly healthy Austin Forkner was born. Austin was born into a farming family, and the farm he was raised on had around 4,000 hogs, 100 cattle, and over 1,200 acres to take care of. Farming always came first. His dad had picked up motocross as a hobby, and that's how Austin got into it, but it was never a top priority. Austin really enjoyed riding his dirt bike, and even though he didn't quite ride it as much as some of his competitors, he was still pretty competitive, and he even began attending Loretta Lynn's, which is the largest amateur race of the year, where he would do fairly well but never quite place inside the top 10. Then, in 2010, everything changed. Austin showed up to Loretta's for the 5th year in a row with just a stock Suzuki 85, where he raced the stock 9 to 11 class as well as the modified class. Austin ended up taking home the win in both classes. It was a bit of a shock to everyone, including Austin, and people couldn't believe that he won the modified class on a stock Suzuki. Going into Loretta's that year, his best finish was a 12th overall, and leaving Loretta's that year, he left with 2 titles and a Fox sponsorship. Shortly after that, he got an offer from Team Green, which is Kawasaki's amateur program, and he would join them. Even with these big changes though, once the Forkners returned home, everything pretty much went back to normal. Mike went back to the farm, Julie went back to her teaching job, and Austin went back to public school and only riding on the weekends. Fast forward a couple of years to 2012, and Austin would debut at an event called the Monster Energy Cup. The Monster Energy Cup was an exhibition race at the end of the Pro Series that gave the best riders in the world a chance to race for $1 million, and also gave amateurs like Austin a chance to get their feet wet on a pro-style hybrid supercross and motocross track and race in front of a large crowd under the lights. Austin would be competing in the Super Mini class, which despite the name is actually the biggest bike that you can race on before going to a full-size dirt bike. So while the bikes are a little undersized while compared to the full-size bikes, and the riders are a little inexperienced compared to the pros, they're all still very good riders, and the bikes are very capable, so the riders were hitting most of the jumps, and the racing was pretty spectacular. Austin would end up going 1-1, taking home the overall win and both main event wins, beating out his rival Chase Sexton, who finished second overall with a third and a fourth place finish. The next year, Austin would again return for the Super Mini class, where he would again go 1-1 and again beat out Chase Sexton, his rival, who would this time go 3-3 for second overall. In 2014, Austin was looking to return to the Monster Energy Cup, only this time competing in the All-Star class, which is basically the last step before going pro, where they ride on full-size bikes, but they're not technically pro riders. Unfortunately, Austin ended up being unable to compete, but he was able to return to the competition in 2015, where he did compete in the Amateur All-Star race, and he ended up going 1-1, once again, beating out Chase Sexton, who ended up going 2-2 for second overall. This would end up leaving Austin undefeated at the Monster Energy Cup event, and Austin seemed to be pretty much ready to turn pro. It is now January of 2016, and Austin debuted in the Arena Cross series, which is similar to Supercross, but just in much smaller stadiums. In his first Arena Cross event, Austin ended up going 5th and 4th in the main events, but then he went to the next event where he would go undefeated, winning the heat race and both main events. Austin continued to make good progress, and there was some debate on whether or not he should make his pro debut at Supercross, but ultimately it was decided to go ahead and skip Supercross, and Austin shifted his focus towards pro motocross to make his pro debut. It is now the summer of 2016, and Austin is lining up for his first ever pro race. In Moto number 1, Austin would go and get 13th place, which was a reasonably respectable start considering it was a 40-rider field. And then in Moto number 2, Austin would finish 7th, which would give him 8th place overall, behind the race winner Joey Savatgy, as well as other riders like Cooper Webb and Aaron Plessinger, but Austin would actually end up beating veterans like Jeremy Martin, as well as Zach Osborne and Christian Craig. It was a very respectable pro debut, and he would end up finishing the season with a 4th overall in the points, as well as 5 overall podiums, the last of which was a win at Ironman. It is now 2017, and everyone's pretty excited to see what Austin can do in Supercross. It is fairly widely known that he is, generally speaking, better at Supercross, and given that he just ended his motocross series with a win, everyone's pretty excited to see what he can do in Supercross. Austin ended up competing in the 250 West Division, and he ended up finishing 8th place overall on the night. Eventually, Austin would go on to get his first podium at round number 4, and he started building momentum with a 2nd place in Arlington, but then the series took a 7-round break for the East Coast series to begin. During that break, Austin ended up suffering a hip injury, which would end up making him miss the Seattle round of the Supercross series, but then he would come back for the final 2 rounds, where he would finish 6th and a respectable 12th in the combined East and West Showdown race. It was a respectable Supercross debut season, maybe not everything that everyone had expected, but Austin attended almost all the races, and he did fairly well. Austin was looking to turn things around a little bit with a fresh start in the motocross series, and he was off to a pretty good start with 5 moto podiums by the end of round 6, and he was 5th in the points overall at that point. Then at round 7, which was at Southwick, things got a little rough again, where in the first moto, he ended up going down in the first turn, and then as he was making his way back to the field, he went down again, and he went ahead and called it a day. Austin regrouped and was getting ready for the next round at Millville. He was riding in Oklahoma and training when he caught a foot bag, and unfortunately, he ended up going down once again. He was laying motionless on the track for several minutes, and then, once he regained consciousness, Austin began rolling around on the ground in a panic. He was blind. As Austin made it back to the hospital, he gradually became more coherent as his senses came back to him little by little, and some visual function, but he was still suffering from delayed visual processing. He was handed a piece of paper with 2 dots on it, as well as a pencil, and told to connect the dots. Austin understood, but he couldn't do it at the time. It became apparent that this was a major injury. Austin ended up taking 2 full months off of the bike to try and recover. Then, even once he did return to his bike, he was easing his way back into things, just riding sandy turn tracks. A couple months after returning to the bike, Austin was trying to finish preparations for the 2018 Supercross season when he went down once again, this time breaking his wrist and collarbone. This was a frustrating setback that caused Austin to take another 8 weeks off of the bike, and it was pretty concerning to see him have another big crash and another setback before ever being able to return to racing. Thankfully, Austin was able to make the season opener for the East Coast rounds, where he would finish 7th after being all the way back in 14th on the first lap. He then went on to win the next 2 races and became locked in a battle with the defending champion, Zach Osborne, for the points lead. Going into round 7, he was only 7 points behind, and he was off to a pretty good start, winning main event number 1 of 3 in the Triple Crown. Unfortunately, in main event number 2, things went completely differently. Austin didn't get off to nearly as good of a start, and as he was trying to move forward, he ended up jumping off the track, landing on a tough block, and going down. Austin regathered himself, only to go down 3 more times and limped in for a 10th place finish. Austin went back, regrouped, and lined up for main event number 3, where everything ended up going completely sideways. Austin had battled his way back up to 3rd after a relatively mid-pack start, when his hand unfortunately ended up coming off of the handlebars while riding in the whoop section. This obviously caused him to crash pretty hard and ended up breaking his collarbone and thus ending his 2018 title chase for the Supercross Series. Austin did end up coming back to race the 2018 Motocross Series, where he had a relatively okay season. He ended up finishing 7th overall in the points, and he also had 1 overall podium finish with a 2nd place at High Point, but most importantly, he ended up racing all 12 rounds. Coming into the 2019 Supercross season, it seemed like it was likely Austin's time. He had the speed last season, and he just showed the consistency in the Motocross Series. However, Austin did have to face the same arena that had just ended his Supercross season last year, as they had changed the schedule, and now the season opener was in Minneapolis. Seemingly unfazed by that, Austin ended up coming out and he won the opener and left with the points lead. Austin then went on to absolutely dominate, winning 5 out of the next 6 races, and still managed a podium at the other one, which gave him a massive 26-point lead over longtime rival Chase Sexton. With only 3 rounds left in the series and exactly a full race worth of a points lead over his rival Chase Sexton, it looks like this title was finally going to be Austin's. Then, tragedy struck again. During qualifying for round number 8, Austin had another bad get-off in the whoop section, causing a full thickness tear of his ACL. Austin knew what was at stake, and he tried to go back out, but unfortunately, he was just unable to do so. It looked like all hope for that Supercross title had been lost, but with the massive points lead and a surprise win out of teammate Martin Davalos, Austin was still your sole points leader going into round number 9, even after not competing in round number 8. With 2 weeks off to allow some swelling to go down and regaining some mobility, and with only 2 rounds left in the series, and still being the championship points leader, Austin courageously lined back up for round number 9. Amazingly, Austin ended up making the main event, and he even began battling in the main event with Chase Sexton, passing him early on in the race. Austin only had a 3-point lead over his rival Chase Sexton, and he knew that meant he would have to beat him at least one of the rounds. So with that knowledge, Austin continued to push forward in the race, and he actually began to challenge for the race win. He had made his way all the way up to 2nd place when unfortunately he overjumped a single jump, and the hard landing caused his knee to pop out of socket, and that ended his race and his title hopes for 2019. Austin still ended up finishing 3rd overall in the points, even after not scoring any points in the last 3 rounds. He ended up going in for knee surgery and just trying to regroup for the year 2020. Austin lined up for the season opener at Anaheim 1, where he'd end up finishing 5th. Not nearly as dominant as before, but off to a solid start. He bounced back nicely at the next round with a win ahead of defending champion Dylan Ferrandis, as well as longtime rival Justin Cooper and up-and-coming star Jet Lawrence. Then at round number 3, Austin would again have problems in the whoop section. He was bucked off and ended up coming home with a 17th place finish. Luckily, this time Austin was relatively okay and bounced back the following week with another win. Austin would then go on to finish the rest of the season with only 1st or 2nd place finishes, with 2 more wins as well as 2 2nd place finishes. Austin had finally made it to a Supercross season finale, healthy and within striking distance of the championship title. Austin was only 7 points down, but this was a East and West showdown, so there was quite a bit of depth to the field and plenty of opportunity for Austin to make up points on championship points leader Dylan Ferrandis. Additionally, Austin had just won the last 2 races against Dylan in a row, so he was really on a hot streak, and the title looked like it could be well within his reach. On top of that, his rival Dylan had ended up having some difficulties in the heat race and had to go through the last chance qualifier, which ended up giving him very bad lane selection for the main event. Things were looking really good for Austin as he got off to a good start, and quickly moved into second place. Meanwhile, Dylan Ferrandis was well outside the top 10. Austin began to close in on race leader Shane McElrath, and if he would take over the lead to the race, that would force Dylan to have to move all the way up to third place in order to take the championship lead back from Austin Forkner. It looked like everything was finally going to come together. Austin was in control of his own destiny. He clearly had the speed to take the lead of the race, and that would likely give him the championship win. Then, like a reoccurring nightmare, Austin tagged his rear wheel on the top of a dragon's back just before a turn, and he ended up going headfirst right into the berm. Austin was out again. The race had to be stopped in order to properly tend to Austin, and just like that, he missed another championship. Austin suffered a laundry list of abdominal injuries, and he ended up skipping the entire Pro Motocross series. Austin once again came back for the Supercross season opener in 2021, and he got off to a reasonable start with a second and then a sixth. But that would be short-lived, as in round number 3, he went down in practice and once again broke his collarbone, thus ending his Supercross season due to injury once again. Austin did come back for motocross, but once again he kind of struggled. He was pretty consistent and he was at least able to attend each race. He did have 3 moto DNFs, but he scored points at every round, and ultimately he finished 7th overall in the championship. Going back into the Supercross season for the 6th time, Austin was again ready to contend for the title. He would have good competition though, going up against young up-and-coming star Jet Lawrence, and Jet would get the better of him at round number 1. However, Austin did finish a strong second behind Jet, showing that he would be a true contender moving forward. Austin was confident moving into round number 2, which was a Triple Crown, and he came out and won the first main event in the Triple Crown. In main event number 2, he would finish in 4th place, which would end up tying him with his rival Jet Lawrence, who had gotten 4th in the first main event and then had won the second one, and also tied him with his teammate Cameron McAdoo, who had gotten a 2nd and a 3rd. Going into the final main event, it was going to be winner take all, and Austin had set out to do just that. He was battling hard with Jet when suddenly Jet made a pretty big mistake, ended up cross-jumping across of Austin's front wheel in the air. This caused both Jet and Austin to crash pretty hard, and Austin ended up breaking his collarbone in the process. Austin would return for the final 3 rounds, and he did even end up winning one in Foxborough, but unfortunately another title chase had ended due to injury. Moving on to the motocross series, Austin did come back for the season opener, where he was off to a relatively solid start going 6-6, but another shoulder injury that he had suffered in preparation for motocross ended up holding him back, and he opted to just go in for a repair surgery, which had him sit out the rest of the season. It is now 2023, and Austin has opted to line back up for the West Coast Championship in Anaheim. He was starting between top rivals RJ Hampshire, Cameron McAdoo, and Jet Lawrence. As the gate dropped and the riders left, Austin ended up bumping RJ, which was to his left, and that sent him to Cameron on his right. This ended up sending Austin tumbling down the start straight, and unfortunately ended up causing him having another full thickness tear of his ACL. On top of that, he also had a meniscus tear, a fracture to his tibia plateau, an MCL sprain, a grade 2 PCL injury, and some fractures in his hand. This was absolutely devastating for Austin and incredibly hard to watch. Austin's season was done before he could go through one turn of racing, while the 3 riders that he was next to would go on to finish 1st, 2nd, and 3rd in the main event. Austin would later return for round number 7 of the Pro Motocross Championship in hopes of earning enough points to enter the first ever Super Motocross Championship. He was gaining momentum and points, grabbing 2 4th-place moto finishes before going into the final moto of the season, where he would have to battle for a position into the top 30 overall Super Motocross point standings. Then, during the final moto of the season, while trying to pass rival Styles Robertson, Austin's rear wheel was kicked up by a braking bump and he ended up going over the bars, and that not only ended his day, but also re-aggravated his earlier knee injury. Although Austin did end up just missing the top 30 in points, he was still able to enter the playoffs as other riders that were ahead of him were not able to race. Austin's knee was still pretty banged up from his crash in the final moto of motocross, but there was a lot of money on the line in the Super Motocross playoffs, and since he was eligible, he decided to go ahead and give it a shot. Austin did not have enough points to seed directly into the main event, so he had to go through the last chance qualifier, which he ended up winning, and then he was off to a solid start to the night when he ended up finishing 6th place in the first main event. Then, in main number 2, Austin ended up going down once again, retweaking his knee even further, and thus ending his Super Motocross Championship bid. Fortunately, he did not tear anything or cause any extreme damage, but the swelling was bad enough that he ended up calling it a season. As 2023 drew to a close, Austin knew it was time to do something different. He needed to get through a full season healthy, and he really wanted to get that elusive Supercross championship. Austin ended up pairing up with trainer Ryan Hughes for a different approach to the 2024 season, and they focused more on form and technique rather than just going fast. Austin and Ryan worked tirelessly through the offseason, and it was working. With the form came more speed and less mistakes. Austin again lined up for the East Coast Series, but this time things went different. Things were working out in his favor. Austin got off to a great start, avoiding an absolutely massive pileup going on behind him, and he went on to absolutely dominate the race and win. Austin now had the points lead and all the confidence. Going into round 2, Austin looked as fast as ever. In the main event, he made a commanding pass for the lead around the outside of his rival Hayden Deegan and began to take control of the race. With only a few minutes left in the race, one of Austin's contacts fell out of his eye, which obviously did cause him to have some vision issues, but Austin continued to press forward. It looked like everything was finally coming together and Austin would be off to another win, when unfortunately, Austin came up just slightly short on a jump in the rhythm section, which caused his arm to come off of the handlebars, which ended up sending him flying off the track over the concrete, where he landed uncontrolled on his back on the bare concrete, which ended up fracturing his L3 and his L4 in his back, as well as fracturing his shoulder blade and causing damage to his shoulder socket, and he also had severely bruised lungs. This was a pretty terrifying crash for everyone to see, and a truly heartbreaking moment for Austin Forkner. Several days after the crash, Austin had this to say.
They said I was out for like 5 minutes, 3 to 5 minutes. It doesn't really matter. I mean, I was knocked out for a long time. It's not, I know I'm really lucky. I'm really blessed to not. I'm really blessed and lucky that I came away from that like I did. I had people texting me like, "Are you okay? Are you alive? Can you walk?" And I didn't understand until I watched the crash back, but that was probably one of the scariest crashes I've ever had or I've ever seen, period.
Since the time of that recording, Austin did end up getting LASIK surgery to repair his eyes so that he would no longer need contacts. It seemed like Austin was on the path to return to racing sooner than later, and there was even some talk that he would return for Supercross. As Austin was going through the necessary checks and scans to get back on the track, there began to be some concern on his brain scans. Austin was born with a brain AVM, which is basically a tangle of blood vessels that creates irregular connections between the arteries and the veins in the brain. Austin and his doctors were aware of this, but after these scans, there was some concern that he was at further risk for possible hemorrhaging and brain bleeding because of this AVM. The concern is that if the AVM were to burst, that would cause a brain bleed, and Austin would likely lose consciousness, and the chances of that happening while riding is fairly likely since Austin trains and rides so much, and that would be an absolutely catastrophic incident to already have a brain injury and then be riding and crash and then have another head injury, and it would likely be fatal. With that knowledge, Austin has decided to go in for brain surgery, and he has had the AVM removed. Amazingly, Austin has already pretty much recovered from his crash in Arlington and is feeling well and ready to get back on the bike, but now he has to recover from his brain surgery. The fact that Austin is still going to be able to compete and still has a positive attitude is absolutely mind-blowing. Regardless of Austin's results in the future, it is truly amazing the amount of things he has accomplished this far in his career, and it is truly amazing how many times he's been knocked down and gotten back up. Hopefully we'll see him return to racing successfully and possibly even get that elusive championship that it feels like he deserves. Either way, Austin, much respect to you and everything you've gone through and accomplished. We wish you all the best, and we look forward to seeing whatever is next in your incredible story. If you guys enjoyed this story or just found it interesting, I would just ask that you share it, not only to bring awareness to Austin's incredible story, but also to bring awareness to the incredible journeys that these motocross athletes have to go through, not only on a weekly basis, but just throughout their entire lives. Austin is a top-tier talent who is getting paid reasonably well, but even with that being said, he's going through all kinds of hardships, and the guys that are more in the mid-pack level aren't making nearly as much as Austin is, but they're putting their lives on the lines just as much. I just feel like this side of our sport is not talked about enough, and I feel like Austin's story is a really good way to highlight that. If you guys have another rider that you would like me to do a life story on, definitely let me know down in the comments below. And either way, let me know what you think of Austin's story down in the comments below. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you in the next video.